Let me introduce you to Nathan Rivera. Nathan grew up in a small town in Ohio. From a very young age, people assumed he wasn't very intelligent. He was slow to speak, slow to read, and never performed well in school. His teachers labeled him as underachieving. His classmates would often laugh at him, calling him slow or dim. But what no one saw was his perseverance. Every night after school, Nathan would sit quietly in his room, reading books that were way below his grade level, but he kept going, slowly, steadily, silently. After graduating high school with below-average grades, Nathan couldn't get into any university. So he took a job as a janitor in a small company that sold office furniture. Every morning, he cleaned the floors. Every evening, he took out the trash, and during his lunch breaks, he sat in the corner of the company's library reading business magazines and books about entrepreneurship. He wasn't idle, he wasn't lazy, he was learning, secretly. He observed everything. He noticed how the sales team handled clients, how the managers led meetings, and how decisions were made. Most people didn't even know his name. They just called him the cleaning guy. But Nathan had a vision, and more importantly, he had grit. One day, the company held a contest. It was open to all employees, even janitors. The challenge? Propose a new idea that could increase sales or reduce costs. Most people ignored it, but Nathan stayed up every night for a week, doing research, analyzing spreadsheets, and writing out a plan. He submitted a simple proposal, redesigned the layout of the showrooms based on psychological buying behaviors. He had read about how humans tend to buy more when products are arranged in a certain way, what he called intentional placement. At first, the executives laughed. Who was this janitor trying to sound like a business consultant? But one manager, a young woman named Evelyn, decided to test the idea in one of the company's smaller branches. The result? Sales increased by 18% in just 3 months. Suddenly, people remembered Nathan's name. He was invited to meetings. He was given a new role, assistant to the marketing manager. From there, he climbed, slowly, steadily, silently. He never asked for shortcuts, he just kept working, learning and improving. 10 years later, Nathan Rivera became the company's CEO, not because he had a degree, not because he had connections, but because he had resilience, curiosity, and courage. When Nathan became CEO, many people were shocked. Some were even skeptical. How could a former janitor lead a company, they whispered. But Nathan didn't care about their doubts. He had spent years building his foundation, not on paper, but through observation, practice, and reflection. During his first speech as CEO, he said, "I was never the smartest person in the room, but I was always the one who stayed curious." That one sentence changed how many employees saw leadership. Nathan didn't lead with ego. He led with empathy. He knew what it felt like to be ignored, underestimated, and overlooked. So his first initiative as CEO was to create a mentorship program for all entry-level staff, including janitors, interns, and receptionists. He wanted everyone to feel like their growth mattered. He believed potential could not be measured by resumes or university rankings. At that time, the company was struggling with high turnover. Employees were leaving because they felt invisible. But after Nathan launched the mentorship program, the atmosphere changed. People began to feel seen, valued, included. And that's when Nathan introduced another idea, something he called the failure room. It was a weekly meeting where teams came together not to brag about success, but to share mistakes. Yes, mistakes. Nathan believed that failure wasn't the opposite of success. It was the path to it. In one meeting, he shared how he once mistakenly erased all the client contact records from the system during his first week in marketing. He had cried that day in the bathroom. No one had known. When he shared this, the room fell silent. Then, slowly, others began to share their own mistakes. And with each story, the team grew stronger, more honest, and more resilient. Nathan was building a culture, one based on trust, growth, and humility. And for those who still judged him for not going to a prestigious university, he simply smiled, because by then he had already been invited to speak at one, not as a student, but as a guest lecturer. He stood on a stage at Stanford and told the audience, "Never let someone else define your capacity. Intelligence has many forms, and some of them can't be measured by standardized tests." The crowd stood up and applauded. Nathan Rivera, the man once called dim, was now a symbol of possibility. After the success of his mentorship and failure room initiatives, Nathan Rivera began to think bigger. He asked himself a simple question. What would happen if every employee, not just the executives, had a voice? He launched a company-wide platform called Speak Up Fridays. Every Friday, employees at all levels could submit suggestions anonymously or present them in person to improve anything in the organization: operations, customer experience, internal culture, or even office snacks. Some executives thought it was a waste of time, but Nathan insisted. People at the bottom see things the top often misses, he said, and he was right. One idea from a delivery driver helped the company cut shipping delays by 40%. Another came from a receptionist who redesigned the welcome experience for clients, making first impressions warmer and more memorable. Nathan didn't just collect ideas, he implemented them, and he gave credit where credit was due. In a world where CEOs often stood far above their teams, Nathan sat beside his. But here's what's important. Nathan wasn't perfect. He made plenty of mistakes as CEO, miscommunications, missed opportunities, failed partnerships. But every time he failed, he did one thing that most leaders didn't. He admitted it, publicly. He would gather his staff, look them in the eyes, and say things like, "I made a call that didn't work, and I learned from it." This kind of transparency didn't make his team lose faith, it made them trust him more. Because when a leader is honest, it gives everyone permission to be human. And slowly, other leaders in the industry started noticing. Nathan was invited to join panels, conferences, and boardrooms filled with Ivy League graduates. Some still questioned him, others were impressed. But Nathan wasn't seeking validation. He was driven by purpose. He often said, "You don't need to be the smartest. You need to be the one who doesn't quit, who keeps learning, who treats others with respect." His leadership wasn't built on dominance. It was built on service. And that's what made it powerful. By the end of his third year as CEO, employee satisfaction had reached an all-time high. Revenue had doubled, and the company had become known not just for its products, but for its people. And Nathan? He never changed his style. He still rode the same bike to work, still greeted every employee by name, still stayed after hours to talk with interns. Because to him, success was not about status. It was about impact. As the years passed, Nathan Rivera's story became well known in the business world. Journalists loved to tell his story as the janitor who became CEO. It was catchy, inspiring, marketable. But Nathan had mixed feelings about that label. He once said in an interview, "Being a janitor isn't something I was ashamed of, but I don't want to be remembered for where I started. I want to be remembered for how I helped others rise." That was Nathan in a sentence, always thinking beyond himself. He began visiting schools in underprivileged communities, not as a philanthropist writing big checks, but as a mentor, as a listener. He told students, "You don't have to fit someone else's definition of smart. Learn how you learn. Grow how you grow." One teenager asked him, What was the turning point for you? Nathan smiled and answered, "When I stopped trying to impress people and started trying to serve people." That mindset became the heart of his leadership. He believed that true success is not what you achieve, but what you build for others. Back at his company, he launched a new division dedicated to internal innovation. The goal? Let employees pitch new business ideas and fund them, even if they failed. To many, this seemed risky, but Nathan saw it differently. If you don't create space for risk, you create a culture of fear. And fear, in his view, was the enemy of creativity. Over time, some of these internal startups grew into million-dollar branches of the company. Others failed, but no one was punished. In Nathan's words, if you never fail, it means you're not trying hard enough. He was rewriting the culture of the workplace, turning it from a hierarchy into a community. He also began pushing for changes in hiring practices. He noticed that resumes were often judged by prestigious schools, brand-name companies, and polished language. But he remembered how he had once been overlooked because of his background. So he introduced blind applications. No names, no schools, just ideas, proposals, and potential. The result? The company's talent pool became more diverse, more dynamic, and more driven. It wasn't just a win for ethics, it was a win for business. Nathan never claimed to have all the answers. In fact, he often said, "The higher your position, the more you need to listen." That was the secret to his leadership. Not confidence, but humility. And through that humility, he built something bigger than a company. He built a movement. Years into his leadership, Nathan Rivera began facing a new kind of challenge: expectation. People expected him to always get it right, to always know the answer, to always have the vision. But Nathan had never claimed to be extraordinary. He simply stayed consistent, patient, open. Still, as the company expanded internationally, the pressure mounted. Investors grew more demanding. Markets became unpredictable. And Nathan's humble, people-first approach was seen by some as inefficient. One board member even suggested bringing in an executive strategist to make tougher decisions with less emotion. Nathan listened, quietly. He didn't interrupt. He never raised his voice. And then he said, "I believe you can be kind and effective. I believe empathy is not a weakness, it's a strategy." He wasn't stubborn, but he wasn't going to abandon the values that got him there. Instead, Nathan decided to adapt without compromising. He brought in advisors, not to replace his voice, but to diversify it. He created cross-cultural leadership teams in every branch. He invested in data analytics to support intuition with insight. He embraced technology to streamline processes, but never let it replace human connection. One of his mottos became well known across the company: use data to guide decisions, use empathy to guide behavior. It worked. Under his leadership, the company weathered economic downturns, navigated global disruptions, and continued to grow sustainably. But Nathan never measured success in profits alone. He often walked the office floors, sat with customer service reps, and asked them one question: what's getting in the way of you doing your best work? And he listened, truly listened. One day, a young intern told him, "Sometimes I feel like no one would notice if I disappeared." That moment hit him harder than any business crisis. He realized that no matter how big a company becomes, its soul lives in its people. So he doubled down on what mattered most: recognition, mental health, opportunities for growth, space to be human. He created the Invisible to Invaluable initiative, focused on identifying overlooked talent and giving them resources to shine. Many of the program's first participants are now managers, directors, and even VPs. Nathan never called it charity, he called it clarity. If we can't see potential in quiet places, then maybe we're not really looking. The world saw Nathan as the janitor who made it to the top, but his true legacy? He lifted others with him. Nathan Rivera never published a memoir. He never started a YouTube channel or became a motivational speaker. Fame was never part of his plan. Instead, he lived what he believed. That real change doesn't need a spotlight, just commitment. One afternoon, years after his retirement, a young woman approached him at a cafe. She was nervous, holding a notebook filled with business ideas. She said, "I read about you in a magazine. I want to build something, but I don't think I'm smart enough." Nathan looked at her with the same calm, patient eyes he'd always had. And he said, "Then you're already smarter than you think because you're not afraid to begin." He handed her a napkin. "Write your first step here." He smiled. Big dreams always start small. That woman went on to build a company of her own. Years later, she credited her success to that single conversation. Not because Nathan gave her a strategy, but because he saw her when she couldn't yet see herself. Nathan Rivera passed away quietly in his hometown, surrounded by family and friends. There were no headlines, no breaking news, but at his memorial, hundreds of people showed up. Some were executives, some were janitors, some were former interns, some were students he had mentored only once. All of them came with a story, a moment, a lesson. One man said, "He didn't just teach us how to lead, he taught us how to see." Another said, "He believed in me before I believed in myself." His company established a scholarship fund in his name, not for top scorers or elite students, but for those who had shown grit, growth, and grace under pressure. Because that's what Nathan embodied. He was never loud, never flashy, but his impact was permanent, a quiet revolution. So if you ever feel like you are too far behind, too slow, too ordinary, remember Nathan Rivera, the boy they said would never make it, the man who made it his mission to lift others. You don't need to be extraordinary to start. You just need to start with extraordinary intent. That's how legacies are built. Silently, steadily, one small step at a time.